you're assembling your palette. I knew I wanted strings, maybe some material that was generic or endemic or something to the time period. There's piano, keyboard, kind of a plucked dulcimer, harpsichord sound. But then also there are mystical elements to it and sort of ethereal, otherworldly elements and some darkness. And so I brought in that great 16th century instrument of mine, the Moog synthesizer.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. The Golem is a spoken word album that offers a thoughtful new twist on the old legend from the point of view of Rabbi Judah Loew, the Golem's creator. I spoke to Eddie Estrin, the force behind this project. Be sure to visit eddieestrin.com to find out more and to order or download this remarkable album.
It's snowing today. Cold white flakes falling steadily on every rooftop, coating the cobblestone streets of Prague, like the accumulation of memory. Wind from the east makes its way.
Eddie, tell me about yourself as a musician and where the Golem album fits in.
Oh, thank you. Basically, I've been playing music all my life. Started out as a child as a drummer, and like a lot of folks from my generation, was watching the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I was kind of, fixating on Ringo, and started banging on pots and pans and sofas in my house. And eventually my parents bought me a real snare drum, and I started teaching myself how to play the drums, worked my way through various rock and roll bands. I was actually working as a musician even in junior high. After that, I became interested in writing music, original music for theatrical productions and soundtracks for indie films, things of that nature. Became fascinated with instrumental music and how it's utilized to enhance the emotional content of material, plays or film. So the album grew out of a chance for me to come up with a long-form piece of music as opposed to, say, something like where I started out with song forms, which, songs tend to be 3.5, 4 minutes long. So it was interesting for me to create a work that had a sustained story arc, a narrative story arc, and the challenge of fitting some original music and sound design to that. So that was really the genesis of my desire to work on this project.
Great. Can you briefly describe the Golem album for us?
Sure. It tells the legend of Rabbi Loew creating a creature of clay, and he's got to defend the Jewish ghetto of 16th century Prague. I like to think of it as new music for an ancient tale, because the story's been around forever in various forms, but it's almost like a radio drama or a play with an interior monologue of the rabbi describing his challenges as a spiritual leader of the Jewish community in Prague and having to come to the decision of basically in a mystic state. He's a Kabbalah master, taking the decision to create a golem, which is an inanimate creature sculpted from clay, and infusing it with a kind of a ruach spirit life to basically do his bidding. And he utilizes the golem in a number of utilitarian ways in the community. But eventually, the golem is called upon to defend the very existence of the Jewish people.
So, as you say, this is a very old story. What inspired you to revisit the story of the golem?
Well, for me, it wasn't so much a revisiting as almost like a first exploration, because as a child, just for fun, I read Greek and Roman mythology, Norse mythology, and was always attracted to these amazing stories of gods and goddesses and heroes and things like that. It wasn't until I was in my 20s when I discovered that there was a fantastic legend from my own tradition, the golem. And so this is something that's always just been in the back of my mind as a very interesting thing to explore. A lot of the versions told are just a traditional narrative. I chose to explore it in a more interior way. It's a little oblique or lyrical or metaphoric.
So, besides being curious, why is the Golem story worth retelling? What meaning does it have for you, and why do you think people need to hear it?
I like your question. I got to tell you, as a creator, the so-called utility or the use of it is not as compelling a reason for me as the act of creation itself. When I'm doing this, I don't necessarily have an agenda to bring forth a story into the world. For me, it's really more an exploration of how I want to tell a story, what sorts of creative directions it might take me in. And I'm hoping that what I do is interesting enough for people who listen or encounter my work to go along with me on the journey.
Okay, fair enough. Talk about the songs that appear between some of the narrative tracks. Why did you change it up that way?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. When I was writing this piece, really I spent about a year assembling it. This was another kind of interesting experiment for me. I didn't design it from the beginning, plotting it out where I knew that A was going to precede B, C, D, blah, blah, blah. Basically, I came up with various discrete bits independently, and later on, almost like a sculptor, assembling them. And the songs to me were just another approach to telling the story. Vayahi Ora, which appears early on in the album, is basically an invocation for let there be light in the world, let the light spread out into the world and exert its positive force. In my piece, Tikkun Olam, which I know a lot of your listeners know, is the concept of repairing the world, individual efforts to improve the world. When I was working on that piece, I had the rabbi talking about the concept, and then this melody just sort of popped into my head. I pictured a beautiful, angelic voice, maybe that you would hear floating through the rafters in synagogue. And so this melody came to me, Tikkun Olam. I was lucky enough to find a really great vocalist, Brianna Fernandez, who did that ethereal soprano voice for me.
I want to ask you about your musical influences. I was surprised when I was listening to the album that I could actually hear kind of classic Doctor Who because of the sort of electronic, harsh sounds. But I don't know if that's what influenced you or that's just what I'm hearing in it. So I was curious to hear more about your own musical influences.
Oh, the electronic aspect. Yeah, that's funny. I mean, typically when you work on a project, again, almost like an artist assembles their materials, so to speak. If you were a painter, maybe you would put 5 or 6 different beautiful paint colors on your palette, and then you have a notion in your head. Is this going to be kind of a sepia piece, or will it be bright colors? And so in my case, I wanted to think about my palette. It is set in the 16th century Prague in the year 1580. And I'm thinking, well, it's kind of a melancholy, very soulful, passionate. I want a cello. So Jacqueline Ultan played the cello parts. A good friend of mine, Bill Lee, who's also a really good klezmer musician, was playing bass clarinet, which ethnically brings that aspect into the music. You know, you're assembling your palette. I knew I wanted strings, maybe some material that was generic or endemic or something to the time period. There's piano, keyboard, kind of a plucked dulcimer, harpsichord sound. But then also there are mystical elements to it and sort of ethereal, otherworldly elements and some darkness. And so I brought in that great 16th century instrument of mine, the Moog synthesizer, and also some other analog synthesizers in my collection. So I hope that they invoke a sort of mystical, powerful, otherworldly aspect to the sonic palette that maybe some traditional instruments aren't typically associated with. I wanted to have that fusion. So I've always been interested actually in the fusion of traditional instrumentation and electronic instrumentation.
Drifting off to sleep in my study, I am visited with veiled answers in the midst of a winter dream. Gimel, Lamed, Mem. Gimel, Lamed, Mem, Aleph. To vanquish the threat, Gimel, I will bring forth a golem.
Cool. So some of the narrative is original to your own imagination. So can you talk about which parts those are and where those new ideas came from that you added to the story?
Yes, I did write the script. The legend is a traditional legend, and there are various versions that have existed over the years. A lot of this stuff just sort of appeared to me. Sometimes I would get in kind of a meditative state. This is something that I've learned to do over the years as a musician and as a composer. Like some writers say, you show up for work. You might have your typewriter in front of you. I might have a guitar or a keyboard in front of me. If you've done your work and you're ready to receive, so to speak, sometimes these things just appear through the ether and enter you. And some people think that you could be a vessel, maybe conducting these elements. And so the stories came from various sources. Like one of the pieces I wrote for the album, which doesn't appear in the traditional literature, I have a piece which I call Moldavite. The origin of that, I was actually in a jewelry store on a vacation with my wife. We were in Hawaii, and she was looking at this amazing, beautiful green stone. And the woman behind the counter explained that it was Moldavite. And I was like, what's Moldavite? And she explained that it came from a meteorite that fell in Prague. The green stone supposedly has some amazing properties, conducting energy and things like that. So, of course, my ears perked up when I thought, Prague, this is great. And then when I came home, I researched it some more and found out, indeed, this meteorite appeared on the banks of the Moldau River, the central river that runs through Prague. So I came up with a scenario where the rabbi was wandering the banks with his grandfather. And this doesn't exist in the literature, but this just came to me, this idea of a small child being captivated by this magical stone and the qualities of light and illumination, and bringing up broader questions of why did this land here, this magical object? And the rabbi's grandfather is speculating, why is this here? Why are we attracted to this? And so you could look at it as a metaphor for the rabbi's ultimate creation of the golem on the banks of the Moldau out of the clay and infusing it with the spark of life, and also kind of indicate the origins of maybe the rabbi's curiosity as a character and his spirituality and his observation of celestial phenomena, which, by the way, historically appears to be accurate. In the court of Rudolph at that time, the emperor, Rabbi Lowe, was there, and he was a respected member. He was a peer, and his intellectual pursuits and his spirituality were respected. So it's an interesting time in Jewish history where the Jews were tolerated. Eventually, they were funneled into the ghetto. But there was a time when they were existing side by side with folks of other faiths. Also in the court at that time, the emperor had astronomers, so they were interested in celestial and mathematical phenomena. Tycho Brahe was there, Kepler was there. So this is a whole intellectual, spiritual, religious, alchemists were there. The rabbi and the people are existing in this realm. So I wanted to kind of call attention to that. This is interesting to me. Some of the other stories, Feigl the Pigeon Keeper, I pictured the golem walking along the road and wanted to give him an interior life too. So he wasn't just portrayed as an automaton, precursor to a robot. And so you get a chance to see him pondering his own existence as he watches the sun go down, and he recalls holding some pigeons, some doves in his hand, speculating about where they go at night. And again, a metaphorical state where the golem is thinking about the fact that he's not going to be on the earth forever. Where does he come from? Where is he going? Some of the questions that we all ask ourselves at some point. Another story that I came up with, which isn't in the literature, the golem is encountering some children gathered around in a circle and being amused by a puppet show. And then he has a chance to walk behind the stage, and he sees a wooden chest where the puppet master keeps these inanimate objects, which ultimately, of course, are infused with a certain life or certain animation when the puppet master controls them. So, again, you could think of the golem as inert creation of clay, but ultimately, with the rabbi's Kabbalistic skills, infuses him with some spirit, some ruach, and then is operating him for the greater ends of serving the Jewish people at that time. Do you want to hear another one? There's Crystal is another one I wrote about. Crystal was an anecdote that I came up with where the rabbi is sitting down to a Shabbat dinner with his kids, and they're lighting the candles and they're blessing the wine, and one of the children breaks a glass. And so The aspect of light going through the shards of glass and the glass being broken, again, a metaphor for a world that isn't perfect and can be broken, and maybe you want to put that together, set that aright. So that's where the crystal anecdote came from.
Excellent. Is there anything you would like to talk about that I have not thought to ask you?
Yeah, one of the things I did want to mention was I want to point out that I have written all the text and written all the music and played a number of instruments on the album. So a lot of folks don't realize that it isn't just me recording a pre-existing text, that I actually wrote the text. The other thing I wanted to say is, as part of the production, I actually created the sound effects for the album as well. So these were not pre-existing things. One example, there are some beautiful ancient bells that appear. They toll at midnight in a couple spots. The story I want to tell about that is my wife and I were in Ireland for a wedding. We were having a nice lunch. And all of a sudden I heard, because I'm always on the alert for interesting sonic material, and I heard the pealing of these enormous bells. So I just set down my fork and dashed around the corner. I had my trusty field recorder with me to capture the sound. And these will appear on the album, tolling out the ominous hour of midnight.
Cool.
Yeah.
So can you name exactly where the bells were? Maybe somebody's been there and they'd like to know that those are the bells that appeared on the album.
I can tell you these are historic bells. We're in Dublin, and I did some research when I got home and found out that this bell tower in Christ Church Cathedral dates to the year 1030. I did find out, however, there was some artillery fire or some explosion or something that burned the tower down and cracked the bells. So those bells aren't quite that old. They had to recast them in the late 1600s. So, yeah, if any of your listeners have been to Dublin, they might have heard these bells pealing. They're very cool, very sonorous, and hopefully evocative on the Golem album.
Cool. Do you know which track we can hear them in so I can find that moment?
On track 10, Formation. I have a line in the script where the rabbi's talking to tolling from the church tower wakes me at midnight. 12 chimes announce the halfway point between darkness and dawn. So it's a section where the rabbi is getting his helpers together, and they're actually going to go down to the Moldau River and create the golem.
To sleep through the night is to lose track of your dreams. Upon awakening, the message may evaporate quickly as morning dew leaves the grass. The tolling from the church tower wakes me at midnight. 12 chimes announce the halfway point between darkness and dawn. Time to summon my helpers.
Did you find the album compelling? Did you enjoy it?
I did. The first time I listened, it was hard for me to focus. I had to listen in the car because, if you're multitasking, you're not really listening. So in the car, I'm doing one thing with words and the other thing is visual, so then I can actually listen better.
That's right. You brought up a really good point, and that is this piece, I thought of it as kind of a traditional old school long form album, which should be listened to hopefully in one sitting. Let yourself get involved in the world of the album. Repeated listenings are rewarding because you can find more levels and more layers. Think of it like a movie, like a film, where there's a lot of elements going on, and you just kind of want to enter that world and live in that world for a time.
Right. It's definitely not background music. It's something that you need to be paying attention to properly appreciate it.
That's right. Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely worth doing so.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me.
It was a pleasure, Heidi. It was just a thrill to be on your Book of Life podcast.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org. and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.